Welcome back to Light the Fuse, your weekly dose of Mission Impossible goodness. How you doing, Charles?
Great. How are you, Drew?
I'm good. We got some fun episodes coming up here in this series. Do you wanna talk a little bit about who Ben Rosenblatt is?
Yeah, Ben is he was the associate producer on Ghost Protocol, and then he was I want to get this credit right. Was he executive? He started at Bad Robot. He'll explain it better than I can. But he was an executive and I think in charge of some kind of post production for Rogue Nation. Maybe I think it was VFX in particular.
Yeah, he's got some great stories about how Bad Robot works and how they got involved and how they did everything they did for Ghost Protocol, including in this episode I'm just going to tease people, a very interesting potential casting choice, let's say.
Oh yeah, we'll definitely be talking about that after this.
But what else? What do you have anything else to set up or any notes to go over?
No, I don't really have anything. I think I'm really excited for people to hear this. It's just it was an amazing interview that he just has so many great stories.
Yeah, and before we get into things, I just want to do my shout outs that this episode is brought to you by Jeremy Dillon and his podcast, My Favorite Album, where he talks to different actors, musicians, performers, writers, directors about the music they love and how it's inspired them and their work. And he said people like Casey Musgraves on, who we still don't know her Mission Impossible rankings. Hopefully we'll get those one day. And Drew Pierce, who co-wrote Rogue Nation, and all sorts of amazing people. So please check that out. And this episode is also brought to you by John B. And I think that's it. But you know what? If you want to become a sponsor on this podcast, all you got to do is go to our Patreon, go to the highest level, or even reach out to us if you want to do like a one-time sponsorship. We will be happy to accommodate you. And, you'll get your name read at the beginning of the show, and everyone will love you and finally have the respect that you so desire from being a sponsor on the show. Don't you think, Charles?
Yes, absolutely.
All right. Well, let's get into Ben Rosenblatt, and we'll be back at the end of the episode to wrap things up. Hello. Welcome back to Light the Fuse. Ben, do you want to sort of give people a little summation of who you are and what your involvement on Ghost Protocol and Rogue Nation was?
Sure, no problem. Yeah, I mean, first of all, it's great to meet you two, and I'm going to have so many questions for you. So I don't know how many of your guests turn the tables, but that's part of my game plan. Yeah, I'm Ben Rosenblatt. I'm a producer. I first touched the Mission Impossible universe, of course, as a fan when I saw the first one in theaters in the 90s, when being in Hollywood was just a twinkle in my eye. But I first touched it in a professional way at Paramount. I was a lowly assistant, and it was this weird time when Paramount had bought DreamWorks, and my boss, who was the head of post-production for Steven Spielberg many years, came over to Paramount, and they were just finishing Mission Impossible 3. So I just barely sort of saw that team as they were getting to the very, very end of it. I was not really involved at all. And then I worked at Paramount for a few years as an executive, and that's where I met J.J. Abrams. And a whole other story, which I won't, waste time with here, but if you ever do a Star Trek version of Light the Fuse, I met him on the first Star Trek movie that he directed, and we got involved in this crazy kind of reopening of the film in the last few months, changing everything, throwing out ideas to make it better. And that kind of brought him and I pretty close. And that started me on my way to working on Mission Impossible Ghost Protocol. At first freelance, but then soon after as an employee of Bad Robot and a producer for Bad Robot. And then in my capacity at Bad Robot, I also worked on Rogue Nation. So I was officially associate producer on Ghost Protocol, and Rogue Nation not credited, but as an executive for Bad Robot.
Wow. You're making us feel real lowly
Oh,
over here.
Come on. I've seen the names that you've gotten on this little endeavor of yours. You're chatting it up with Brad. You're chatting it up with McHugh. You're chatting it up with, Oh my God. Like, it's just crazy, you know?
Well, you sent us over a long list of things that could be topics we could discuss. And speaking of Brad, one thing that you wrote in here was Brad Bird's iPad sketch of me.
Oh, yeah.
What's that?
It's just like, this is just like a tiny delight. There's not really like a story to it, but we were prepping Ghost Protocol when just after the first generation iPad had come out, right? The like kind of bulky, heavier one, you know? So I had one, a few others had one, and I had just ordered a third-party product before they came out with like the Apple Pen or whatever it's called, the stylus, a third-party stylus, you know? And you guys have talked to Brad, so you know he's just the greatest guy. He's like,
Yes.
He's just like talking to one of your buddies, right? Like he's just a cinephile, and he's just a, you know, and kind of as regular as dudes come and people come in this industry. But so he's like, you know, he should be like focusing on prepping the movie, but he sees that I got the stylus. He's like, what's that? You know, he's like really into it, and I was like, yeah, I just got this stylus for my iPad, and he grabbed it to try it out and then started sketching me. And I can I share my screen here? Can I show you the?
Yeah, we can include this in our show notes as well, so everybody can see it.
Cool.
If you're okay with including it and allowing people to see it publicly.
Yeah. No, I have it public facing anyway because I love it so much. So I'll just send this to you guys right now. I'll just email it to you, and you can see. It's just a silly little sketch he did, but it was like, you know, with first generation iPad, first like ever stylus product that came with it, you know?
Well, if you were in development at Ghost Protocol, maybe you can speak to the development of Ghost Protocol, which is really fascinating to us. I mean, we were told by somebody recently that Harrison Ford was supposed to be the bad guy in one draft. Do you remember this at all?
Yeah, you know, I don't remember the draft with Harrison Ford as the bad guy, but I do remember that the secretary, they really wanted it to be Gene Hackman. To the point where the previs, remember the sequence with the secretary's car and the bridge and it falls off the bridge and that whole thing?
Yeah.
To the point where when we did the previs for that sequence, they grabbed a little like Gene Hackman looking figure because they wanted Gene Hackman to be the secretary so bad.
Wow.
It ended up being Tom Wilkinson, right? Like,
Yeah.
I think, who's
Not
great,
too shabby.
you know?
Yeah.
Not too shabby at all. But like, yeah, Gene Hackman was like definitely the dream for him. And then the other thing that, I apologize, I haven't listened to all your episodes, so you have to tell me when you're like, if I say something that you're like, oh yeah, somebody told us about that or didn't.
Right.
But I'm fully ready to like burn bridges and get myself in trouble here. Is like one of the most interesting things. So Josh and Andre, who wrote Ghost Protocol, you haven't had them yet, right?
No, but if you would like to put us in touch, we would love.
I'll be happy to.
Oh, wow.
Most of my questions are around like who you haven't had, like because you've gotten so many people. It's like, have there been conversations with JJ yet?
No.
JJ has ignored an email, but we've heard that you could maybe bridge that gap.
Well, I don't know if I would, but I certainly could put you in touch with people that might be, perhaps the other. I mean, maybe even more interesting than JJ's Brian Burke. Have you guys talked to Berkey?
No, we are dying to talk to him.
We would love to talk to Brian too. Yeah.
I feel like Berkey, I will personally call Berkey and encourage him to do this because I think he'll enjoy it a lot, but he will be the most entertaining interview that you guys have.
Oh, great.
Hands down. No question. Berkey,
love that.
Berkey is the best, and that might lead you to JJ. The other one that I thought would be a slam dunk is Giacchino. Michael Giacchino. Have you had him?
We have talked to him.
Oh, you have talked to Michael Giacchino. Now, have you talked to his brother?
We're in the process of getting his brother. We've been in touch with him. We were going to get him on the show right before he got nominated for an Oscar, and then he just got pulled into all the Oscar stuff, and then we haven't been able to get him on the show. He's been obviously very busy since then, I think.
He's magnificent. Obviously, he did all the behind the scenes for Ghost Protocol.
Yeah.
So he's got some, and he, has a very tight relationship with Brad Bird. And he'll see. This is how I want to derail this interview. Is I just want to talk about guest booking for your show.
You were about to drop some bombshell.
I don't know if it was a bombshell. This may be public knowledge. It may not be public knowledge. But obviously when the studio was going into Ghost Protocol, MI3 hadn't performed as well as they wanted to, even though it was sort of better received by critics. Yeah, it's easier to tell these stories because like everybody's moved on, like all the regimes are different at Paramount and all this kind of stuff. But anyway, but has anyone talked to you guys about how the desire on the studio side was for the torch to be passed to Jeremy Renner? Like that's why he was there.
Yeah, a little bit, but we haven't gotten the specifics. So if you want to sort of break that down.
Well, what I can tell you about the specifics is like fairly simple, which is that the hope on the studio side was that Ghost Protocol would end with Tom, becoming the secretary.
Okay.
And that would be his way of sort of like staying involved in the franchise, but leaving room for the torch to be passed to Jeremy Renner. And they tried as late in the game as about halfway through production, like the shoot, to make this kind of ending happen. So much so to the point that I think the actual ending we reshot later on, just because there wasn't a lot of focus on it because wasn't sure what exactly it was going to be. But Tom never really entertained the idea, and obviously he was right, because he's been like, these subsequent films have been incredibly successful, and everyone continues to love seeing him in the role. But it got, like, Berkey could probably tell you some interesting stories if he dares to, about, because I wasn't in the middle of those conversations, but I heard secondhand about them, and it was pretty wild. And as you can imagine, like, the studios pushing sort of as hard as they could. Bad Robot was kind of in the middle of it, right? Like, they were like, well, we understand this hand. It's like, you want to stay relevant and compete with the Bourne, franchise of the world, which at that point was already very successful, right? And then you had Tom, who's like, Tom, how about Tom? When are you guys going to have Tom on this thing? Like, what's that plan?
We're trying.
McCory said 200th episode, so we're inching closer.
We're hoping for the 200th. We'll see.
Which episode is this going to be? What is this going to be?
This will be like 170 or something, right?
Somewhere.
Have you guys ever talked to him at all?
No, not yet.
Oh. It's gonna be the greatest experience of your life. Like, that's one of these things in the world, like Niagara Falls, like the Grand Canyon, like talking to Tom Cruise. It's like, it fully delivers. It's just like, it's everything you want it to be. And I think the best part is that he'll, like, when he does it, he'll really engage with you guys, which will be cool.
Well, we think he'll appreciate our enthusiasm, obviously.
I think he does already. I mean, he must. Like, I haven't talked to him about it, but like, I'm sure they do. Tom is the greatest. But anyway, Tom has more conviction than any billion people on the planet, and so he was just sure that was not the right way to go, the secretary thing, and he wasn't going to take it. And so that didn't end up happening. But yeah, there were certain set pieces of Ghost Protocol that from very early on we knew we were going to do. I think one of the earliest ones was Burge, of course. You guys have probably heard that story a bunch. My favorite sequence, which is the switcheroo, we used to call it, which is in the hotel rooms, the two rooms that are above one another, we just called it the switcheroo, and that was like very classic Mission Impossible and like one of the greatest sequences. But there were a lot of pieces that came together very, very late. A lot of casting that came together, really late as well. So yeah.
Well, on the subject of casting, Charles and I are obviously obsessed with the idea of how close Vanessa Redgrave came to coming back. And I'm sure you were intimately involved in those conversations and those machinations. So how close did it get?
I wasn't intimately. I mean, like, again, I've since, I do more stuff nowadays in my current projects, but like, I was adjacent to a lot of these conversations. And my understanding with Vanessa Redgrave was just a money thing. Just came down to what she wanted. I think if I remember correctly, she wanted $1 million just for kind of a cameo,
Right.
I think when Brad Bird talked to us about it, I think he said something along the lines of like Paramount wasn't willing to pay her what she's worth or something like that.
Yeah, I think it was, she asked for $1 million. And I think the plan to have her in it was not an extensive role. I think it was that role when they're just after the safe house. It's in Dubai.
Yeah.
And yeah, the whole idea was like, oh my God, here she is, And what was her name again in the first one? I can't remember.
Max,
of course. So yeah, so like, oh, it's Max, and we're so excited about that idea. But I think, yeah, it was like, I'm pretty sure that they asked for $1 million, and I think it's funny because in the scheme of things, you're like, oh, this is a big movie or whatever. But if you think back to when Ghost Protocol was made, the franchise was still on rocky footing. I think Tom himself had come off of, what was that movie that did not do very well?
Lions for Lambs?
No. Lions for Lambs was one of them, but there was another one that had come out, and this is how they made Tom's deal, which I believe was like a bit less lucrative than his other deals. It was
Valkyrie or Night and Day.
Night and Day. It was
or...
Night and Day. That was the one. Night and Day. Yeah, Night and Day had come out, I want to say, while we were prepping Ghost Protocol, I think. Because I remember that being like the last piece of the puzzle to making Tom's deal, was when that movie came out and it didn't do very well. Paramount was able to get the deal that they wanted, or closer to the deal that they wanted. So yeah, so that's just to say that, like, the circumstances around making Ghost Protocol were very different to the circumstances after Ghost Protocol. Ghost Protocol came out, did huge business. The franchise was back. Tom as a star was, international star was back. And I think subsequently, they could get whoever they want. And I think they have now, right? Brought Max Bass.
Well, they brought back her daughter, and there is a reference to Max, but we always thought it was weird that the guy that chauffeurs them to the meeting place is the guy from the first movie, is Max's guy.
Right.
Yeah, so it's a nice little Easter egg for fans, but you could tell that it was going to maybe lead to Max, and instead it leads to this other arms dealer guy.
Yeah. I think, anyway, it would have been very cool. We were all very excited about that idea. I think there was a lot of talk during the prep and production of Ghost Protocol about the first film and about how to sort of recapture what that was. I think we all loved JJ's as well, but that first film really had a certain kind of magic. And so any elements that could touch that, even as a sequence, was something that everybody was interested in. So I wish that had happened, but unfortunately it hadn't happened with her.
Well, that extends to the crew too, right? You wanted to talk about how you guys got Paul Hirsch on board.
Yeah, it's just like, these are just like, when you guys emailed me, I just like thought of like these things came to mind, and I was like, well, you probably wouldn't know them right off the bat, but I saw you talk to Paul pretty extensively, like six parts.
Yeah, we're kind of lobbying to be his surrogate children at this point, but
Paul really is the best though. I mean, he's such an incredible guy. So and again, stop me if you guys have heard some of these before, but Brad wanted Walter Murch to cut the film. He's close with Walter. Do you guys know Walter Murch?
Yeah, of course.
I know of him. I don't know him personally.
Yeah, of him. You know of him. So you know Walter Murch, famous for his role on Godfather and then in the Francis Ford Coppola world, and like really just being this, guy up in the Bay Area who's a real genius in the world of editing. His book, I think it's called Blink of an Eye. He's just really an incredible editor, and that was Brad's dream to have him cut the film. So he came down one day. I spent the day with Walter. He met everybody. We all talked. Everybody was sort of in awe of Walter. But ultimately, his agent, who's, one of my less favorite agents in the town, just like wanted more money than we could put to this, like way more money than we had for the role, right? And ultimately, again, nowadays with the Mission Impossible franchise, it would be hard to see things not happening because of money, just because it's been so successful. But in those days for Ghost Protocol, there were a lot of conversations around money and a lot of conversations about what we could afford and what we would pay and all that kind of stuff. So Walter didn't work out because his agent was asking for way higher than what his quote was. And, so I had to tell Brad that, we'll find someone else, find someone who's just as good. And while I was reassuring everybody, I was sort of freaking out because I was like, it's a strange thing with the way that it works in finding key crew in the industry is unusual, because like the best way to find someone is to have worked with them or know someone who's worked with them, and you can really vouch for what it's like to work with that person. What happens in reality is most people are hired based on their credits, which isn't necessarily reflective of how valuable or not valuable that person is, because it's hard to say on any given film. It's like, is The Godfather great because of the editor, or is it great because of Francis Ford Coppola, or is it great because of, Al Pacino? It's like, these are all parts of a whole. So I was sort of freaking out because I was like, okay, here we've said no to Walter Murch because of money. And that was like a sort of a slam dunk creative person to be on the show. I had no idea who I was going to put forward to be like, well, Brad, you can't have Walter Murch, but look who you can have. And I was sitting in the kitchen at Bad Robot, and I just remember doing something as simple as Googling. I just went online, or IMDb. I went on IMDb, and I was like, well, we all love the first film. And I just looked up the first film, and I was like, who edited the first film? And I click on this name, Paul Hirsch, who I had no idea, didn't know who he was. I start looking at his credits on IMDb, and I'm like, wait a second. This guy cut Star Wars, and this guy cut like Ferris Bueller's Day Off, and he's like, oh my God, like, you're just like looking down the list, and you're like, wait a second, like, Empire Strikes Back, he cut, like, you're just like, this guy has cut a lot of classic films that we all love, and I didn't understand not only why he hadn't been put up for the job, but I hadn't even really heard of him before, So I'm trying to kind of figure that out, and I'm looking at it. I'm looking at his IMDb right now, and like it brings back the memories of like, Carrie, the first Star Wars, Empire Strikes Back, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, Planes, Trains, Automobiles, Steel Magnolias. Like, not only has he cut all of these amazing classic films that we all love, and the first Mission Impossible, but also to have just like a sort of diversified resume that way, like all different kinds of films. Like the best Mission Impossible films, I think, are ones that have comedy and they have action and they have suspense and romance and all this stuff. So then I look at it a little closer and I'm like, oh, I wonder if it has anything to do with this Adventures of Pluto Nash that he cut. And then suddenly, like, oh, except for Ray, the films are like, oh, there's not very much here, So as it turns out, that's like what happened is he cut Pluto Nash. It was a huge bomb, one of the biggest bombs of all time. The Eddie Murphy film, if you remember it at all.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, so I call up his agent and I get in touch with Paul. And he's like so surprised that I'm calling him because people don't call him anymore to do these films. And I just, in Paul, just the way you guys have, I met like a wonderful like surrogate father figure who was like, we hit it off immediately. And I sort of embarked on selling him to everybody. And it was like, everybody was mystified. They were like, wait, you're telling me we can have one of the editors of Star Wars, one of the editors of Empire Strikes Back, and he's going to cut this film, and he cut the first film, and what? And like, it was kind of a slam dunk for everybody. And Paul jokes with me. He's like, thank you for Googling me or whatever. You know what I mean? Like, it really, brought him back to the forefront of conversations. And I'm happy it did. I mean, Tom was really happy to be working with him again. I think Tom obviously has like a super special connection to the original. I mean, I assume Paul has told you his Brian De Palma stories and like how close they were and all that kind of stuff.
Oh yeah, and how instrumental he was in pushing that movie through the finish line. Suggesting Danny Elfman for the music and everything. It's just very weird to hear of Paul Hirsch as somebody's second.
It was wild
choice, or not even a choice. Right?
He wasn't even on the radar. He wasn't even on a list anywhere. I had other people on lists. Everybody I had on the list was not interesting. And I was like, nobody here's a slam dunk. I can't say no to Walter Murch without somebody who is equally as impressive. And then this perfect candidate fell into my lap, who I didn't realize would also be like a great friend and really like the absolute perfect person for the job. And so anyway, that's kind of how that happened. And later, Brad did work with Walter Murch on Tomorrowland.
Correct.
Which didn't go great.
No. They had a lot of work to do. I mean, editorially, there was a lot of stuff on that one.
And I wasn't part of that film, but I did see it, unfortunately. And it breaks my heart because Brad, again, is the great, like, he's my hero. Like when people ask me who I've worked with, I'm most inspired by, it's probably Brad. But, sometimes they just don't come together. And my understanding is they really went through the ringer with Disney in the studio on the post side editing that picture. And I don't remember if it was they brought someone else in to cut with Walter. Something happened that it was just not great. So anyway, but I had a lovely day with Walter Murch, and I'll always treasure that day. And then I have a wonderful friendship with Paul Hirsch, and he mentioned me in his book, and it was like, he was just like everything about my friendship with Paul Hirsch and his daughter Gina, who's a wonderful editor herself.
Yeah, we've had her on the show as well.
Oh, you have? Oh, great. Yeah, Gina's awesome. Of course, she got to be part of our crew, and we were lucky enough to have her as part of our crew, and that was awesome. Yeah, we sort of like cobbled this crew together, but it was for editorial, but it was, my brother was a PA on it. Evan Schiff was somebody that I'd worked with a bunch, and I sort of like match made him with Paul, which, wasn't Paul's favorite thing at first, but ultimately ended up working out great. And so
we love Evan.
Yeah, Evan is awesome. So so it's just like, that's how Paul Hirsch came to be, but it was wonderful all around. It was just a great thing we did. The only bad thing I can say about Paul Hirsch has to do with me, and that is when we were in Prague starting to shoot, this is so embarrassing, but it was like, I was working, because at this point I was working for Bad Robot and on the film, and oftentimes when I'm in Europe, I'm working both sets of hours, like LA hours and Europe hours, and we were having a hell of a time trying to figure out how to get the dailies projected in this Four Seasons hotel. And it was a whole drama. But Paul had come out for like the first week of shooting or so. He didn't want to be on location, but he wanted to like the line producer, Jeffrey Chernoff, who would also be a good one for you guys to talk to. Have you talked to Jeffrey?
No, but we would love to talk to Jeffrey as well.
Chernoff, I can put you in touch with Chernoff. Chernoff's got great stories, including, if he'll tell you the story, a random black eye he got during the Moscow plate shoot that they did, which, you should hear that story. But yeah, anyway, so Jeffrey was like, yeah, let's bring the editor out. I brought Paul out. He was out with us, but everyone was too busy shooting. So I was just like hanging out with Paul, but crazy tired. So finally one night we go out for beers and Paul is telling me, like, I get him to tell me his like Star Wars stories, like the best, like really, like, how did you get to work on Star Wars? What was it like? And I was so tired, and I not because of the story, but because of me, I like fell asleep during the story. And it was like the absolute, it was the only time I've ever fallen asleep talking to someone. It was like it was the most interesting story I've ever heard. It was really tragic. Anyway. That's my Paul Hirsch Hall of Shame, but he's one of my heroes, and I love this guy.
You're in development. I was wondering, what is the most different version of this movie that you remember, either in script form, rough version of it? I would really love to know sort of where it started and we know where it ended, obviously, but
I don't have a great answer for that on Ghost Protocol, because from what I remember of the process, it was the part of the movie that went through the most changes was more the third act. I remember the second act was always more or less what it was, and the first act did go through some changes, but it was that third act that came together the absolute latest. I don't have a great answer for that, but I do remember on Rogue Nation, and I don't know if McHugh talked much about the development process. I imagine, McHugh would only want to talk so much about like that part of it. What I remember about Rogue Nation is that movie changed dramatically through development because it had a very long prep, like one of the longest preps I've ever seen. I don't remember the final weeks, but I want to say it spent a year in prep with like crew on and everything.
Wow.
And there was a whole version of the movie that McHugh had written with Ethan doing a whole gag similar to the beginning of the first Mission Impossible. It was like, if I remember this correctly, it was like a whole apartment setup or a room setup, but then it turns out that room is on a stage and in a warehouse or something. But the idea, I remember this, the idea was that a room was set up and it was like it was in a room and then it was like on a cargo ship. And it turned out they were on a cargo ship. And it was this whole opening sequence, or it was in the first act of the film. It was a big deal, and they had the cargo ship design, and there was concept art and everything, and it was everybody was working to prep that. And then one weekend, McHugh has a meeting with TC, and it all goes away. He's like, he didn't like that. And I think, if I remember correctly, and I could be making this up, so time will tell or not, but I think that ended up being replaced with the opera sequence. I think that's how the opera sequence came around. I think.
Right.
Well, Charles, weren't there a couple of movies where there was a cargo ship graveyard sort of sequence?
Yes, and it was going to be used for the finale of Ghost Protocol at one point, and the finale of 3 at one point too, I believe.
It's so interesting. Yeah, it was a whole thing, and I remember it being a really cool sequence, and like obviously Tom has, strong ideas, and McHugh has like incredible instincts, but I just remember it going away so quickly. And I think Tom, ultimately, if that was how the opera sequence came about, anyway, in any event, the opera sequence is one of those things that was just like, there are a couple sequences in these films that you have these set pieces and they're put together and nobody knows if they're going to work. One of my favorite stories, I think I mentioned this to you guys, is in Ghost Protocol, the hallway projector screen sequence with Benji, with Simon in the Kremlin, right?
Yeah,
you remember that sequence? Mm-hmm. And when they cut that sequence and they screened it for the studio and for the producers and everybody, nobody thought it worked. It was just dead silent, and everyone was like, this is a disaster. We have to recut it entirely. We have to make it much shorter, or we have to make it more exciting or more suspenseful. And in fact, again, I don't know if anybody told you this, but like when the first cut of Ghost Protocol was screened, the director's cut, screened for the studio and screened for the producers, the studio felt strongly that this was a problem. Like, they had strong ideas about recutting all of it. They really thought it was not going to work.
Just the Kremlin sequence?
No, the whole film. The whole film. They had a lot of thoughts about the film. Absolutely. The reason they took it to this preview was because, the way previews go in the industry, it's like it's meant to bolster someone's case, either the studio's case to change things or the, filmmaker's case to not change things or however it is, right? And that was what was going to happen. The studio was like, here's what we're going to do. We're going to preview it. It's going to get a lowish score. And because of that low score, we're going to use that as a, ammunition to change things the way we wanted to do a whole recut. And Bad Robot was kind of in the middle of it. I think both Berkey and JJ sort of saw that side of it and were like, yeah, this could be stronger and all that. Brad thought that it was working largely. And Brad thought there were things, by the way, Brad wanted to reshoot some things, pick up some things. Like, he did not think it was all perfect. Tom thought strongly that it was going to play great. Tom was like, let's take this to preview. Let's see how it plays. And so the preview screening, which I want to say was in Arizona. I think Paramount often previews in a place called Peoria, Arizona, which is hilarious because it's like, I don't know if you know that expression of like how it plays in Peoria, which is referring to Illinois, Peoria. But anyway, so we previewed it there in Arizona. And I was sitting next to Paul Hirsch in the preview. It was a full house. And I remember it was the hallway sequence, the projector one that I was talking about, that was the moment that we realized, like, what was going to happen at that preview was the studio was all ready to get the score in, have the conversation, be like, Brad, Tom, like, we're going to need to do all these things, that, and JJ and Brian were on board. They were like, okay, we'll be the honest brokers. And then everybody was ready for this conversation. And they're like, Tom will have to listen to us once he sees the score. We get in there, we're previewing, and I'm sitting next to Paul. Paul's riding the volume fader during the screening. That's like Paul's doing that. And we get to the projector sequence. And up until then, everyone thought that sequence was a disaster because it was so quiet, and long. And in this full house, people were just losing their shit. They were just laughing so hard at it. And it was like it only needed an audience. And once an audience was there, every moment that Paul had let breathe in the cut with Brad was playing like with huge laughs. And the sequence was just on fire. And it was like undeniable how good it was. And Paul turns to me and he just like, with a big smile on his face, like a little kid. And he just like did his thing. I'm sure you've seen Paul do his thing where he raises his eyebrows, And he did that to me. And I was just like, oh boy, here we go. And the screening finished. It played so well. I think it scored like a 93, I want to say it was, which is phenomenal for like preview scores work where everybody in the audience marks down. Do you guys know this? Like they mark down. So the top two boxes. Yeah. So it's like the percentage of people that called it either excellent or very good was like 93%. Right. And so it's such a good score. And everybody met the projection booth afterwards. And they read out the score, 93, and everyone was like, holy shit, they couldn't believe it. And Tom was just like a mixture of ecstatic and high-fiving, but also like confident, like, I knew it, I told you so, like that kind of thing. and I just remember the thing that I think Adam Goodman, I think, was the head of the studio at the time, and Mark Evans was his number two, and they were sort of like, oh, great job. The wind was taken out of their sails. And then I just remember JJ being the one, there was a meeting set up for the next day. That was the meeting where all the details, they were going to go through the post-mortem and talk about everything we need to do in the movie. And I remember JJ speaking up and saying, do we even need this meeting tomorrow? And they couldn't say anything. And they were like, nope, I guess we don't. Adam Goodman was like, we don't. And Tom was like, no, great. Okay, good. And all that happened from there was bringing on Damon Lindelof to write some stuff for additional photography, which is all fun. But from there on out, it was like smooth sailing because it was like, oh yeah, the movie totally works. So, well,
we love the story that Bird still wanted to shoot that extra stuff. Like he still wanted to.
Yeah. Yes, he told us that when we interviewed him that there was a moment where everybody felt like, okay, well then we're done, and he was like, whoa, well, there's like a couple things we can do to make this really a little bit better,
And he was right, like so
that must have been right then.
All the stuff we got was great, and it was additive, and I love that about Bird. He was just like, Bird is in it for the filmmaking. Like he's just always in it for the filmmaking. It's just so great. Yeah, this is the stuff he wanted to do when he finished the director's cut, and he's like, let's go do it, and everyone did. Anyway, the rest is history.
Wow.
All right, one in the bag, Charles. How you feeling?
Great. There's just so many great things he talked about. And by the way, the sketch of Ben that Brad Bird did will be in our show notes. So you can check that out on our website, LightTheFusePodcast.com, and then go to the episode guide and find this episode, and you'll see the sketch that Brad Bird did on Ben's iPad. It's great. I think the biggest thing that we need to talk about is the casting of the secretary and who they wanted for Ghost Protocol. That was just crazy.
Yeah, a lot of fascinating casting what ifs on Ghost Protocol, but that is crazy.
Yeah. Gene Hackman was retired at the time, right? His last movie that he made was what? Something like almost 10 years before that. So I don't know how they thought they were going to be able to get him.
Well, I'm sure if the check is big enough that they can get anybody, but yeah, I think was Welcome to Mooseport his last one?
Yeah, Welcome to Mooseport in 2004. So, this was they were probably shooting this 6 years later.
Right. Yeah, that would have been pretty great. To remind people, obviously, we have heard that Harrison Ford was wanted for the bad guy.
That was the big reveal at the end of the movie, right? They were going to shock us with Harrison Ford showing up at the end as the villain.
And then, obviously, we get into a little bit in this episode about the particulars of Vanessa Redgrave not coming back.
Yes.
She wanted $1 million for the role. Paramount did not want to pay her. And I think they probably should have paid her. What do you think, Charles?
Yeah, she's worth it. That would have been amazing.
Yeah.
Would have loved to have had Max come back.
I think the franchise at the time was a little bit more on uneven footing, and also with, an unproven director. I'm sure it was a lot less appetizing to give that money over. But
that's what was so fascinating in talking with Ben about this. About his whole interview was just talking about Ghost Protocol and where the franchise was at the time. And it's really interesting. I think he talked about it in this part, and I think in next week and the week after, I'm sure he'll hit on it again. But it's really interesting that that's where Mission was at the time, where they had to be tight with the budget. It's kind of crazy.
Yeah, and I also liked in this episode that we got more information about the cargo ships. How many times are they going to try to use a cargo ship in one of these movies?
But it was a different cargo ship thing. It was the whole... it was the opening of the movie, right, where it was going to be a mousetrap, and then it was going to be revealed that the mousetrap was actually on a cargo ship.
Yes.
That would have been
pretty cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also interesting, they talked about how Rogue Nation was such a different movie because the prep, it was like a year, they were in prep for like a year or something, and there was a totally different version of the movie they just threw out. That's fascinating.
Yeah. Rogue Nation went through some different versions, it sounds like, but...
Yeah,
we really thank Ben for his time. He was very generous chatting with us because we have 2 more episodes of Ben coming back. So I hope you enjoyed listening to Ben as much as we did.
Yeah.
Charles, you have some shout outs to give today?
I want to give a special thank you to Robbie J. Martin. And I also want to credit our editor and mixer, Luke Burson, and our composer, Kevin Blumenfeld. And tell people they need to come back next week because there's some really amazing things. His story next week about being Tom Cruise's best friend for a day is incredible, and you need to come back and hear that. And I also want to tell people to sign up for our Patreon. It's patreon.com/lightthefuse. We've been doing a lot of great episodes over there recently. We did an addendum to our Rogue Nation making of. We found a couple more things to talk about with Rogue Nation, and it was after we had already completed the making of, and so we did a little additional episode about the making of Rogue Nation. So that's a really great episode that we did. And we also just did a Daniel Craig James Bond movies episode where we broke down the 5 Daniel Craig James Bond movies and talked about what we liked about them and what we didn't like about them. And other great episodes coming up as well. So please sign up for our Patreon. You can get the bonus content, or you can sign up at the higher level to join our Skype chats that we do every month. Yes, for some reason we still use Skype. I don't know why. When we record together here, we do Zoom, and we talk to our interviewees. We talk on Zoom. And for some reason, we still do our Patreon chats on Skype. Why is that?
I think we're keeping Skype afloat by just using them for our. I don't know. Maybe it works a little bit better internationally. Although we just did one. We did a chat with Jacob Jacous, who is in
Jacob Juice.
Yes, he's in Belgium, right, or Holland. He's in Holland.
Mm-hmm.
And we use Skype, so I guess internationally it doesn't really matter. But we have an amazing assortment of international guests, and we would love for you to be a part of that chat once a month on our Patreon for sure. So
yeah.
You can also go to our TeePublic page. There's always a special running that you can get a t-shirt or a sweatshirt or whatever you want. And just want to remind everybody to like, subscribe, rate, and review. Is that it? Did we cover all of our housekeeping, Charles?
I think we did. Just make sure to come back next week.
Yeah, Ben is a great interviewee, and these next two parts have just as much hilarious and illuminating content as you got in this first one. So please come back. All right, that's it.
Thanks again for listening, everyone. Before we go, another mission, should you choose to accept it, please rate, review, and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And remember that you can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at LightTheFusePod, and email us questions or comments at lightthefusepodcast@gmail.com. This message will self-destruct in 5 seconds.